Hello, everybody. I'm Harvey Mansfield, and this is the program on constitutional government at Harvard. Our guest today is Mark Blitz, who is a professor, the Fletcher Jones Professor at Claremont McKenna College. Mark Blitz got his BA at Harvard in 1966, his PhD at the same place in the same department shortly thereafter. He has experience in Washington, D.C. He was Associate Director of the United States Information Agency in the Reagan administration. He's also taught at Harvard and at Penn. And he's written books. So his first book, I'm going to show them to you. It's his dissertation, Heidegger's Being in Time. And there's another one, Duty Bound.
You can talk, I'll hold.
Yeah, it's about responsibility. A long subtitle I can't read from here.
Responsibility in American Public Life.
Plato's Political Philosophy. This is a powerful book. And most recently, Reason and Politics, not recent, but Reason and Politics, the Nature of Political Phenomena. But perhaps the most relevant to our topic today is the book that he wrote in 2011, published by the Hoover Institution, called Conserving Liberty. See his title there, and his name, Mark Blitz. And he's going to talk today on liberating conservatism. Mark.
Good, thank you. Well, thanks. As we just said, my topic is liberating conservatism, a topic that we thought would be useful to discuss. And my discussion is, in a way Harvey indicated, is connected to a book I wrote 12 or 13 years ago called Conserving Liberty. And the talk and the book draw indirectly, at least, on my experience in government and as research director of a think tank, the Hudson Institute, but it doesn't draw primarily on that. And although I won't be discussing directly today's varieties of conservatism, neo, paleo, big government, small government, common good, libertarian, populist, elitist, and all those other conservatisms, though I won't be discussing them directly, I have some of that in mind as well. So on to liberating conservatism. One element of conservatism is to face matters as they are. But I'll begin not by listing all of our immediate problems, which may or may not prove fleeting, but by mentioning three constraints, I think, that limit or direct any political attempts today at reform. One of these limits is national security. This requires ever-advancing technology, and that in turn requires expertise, specialization, some continued globalization, and vast wealth. A second current limit is people's wish, at least in this country, for great amount of goods, including health at reasonable prices. And production today demands certain kinds of training, of specialization, of expertise, and of management. And this wish for wealth, of course, is also a great constraint on electoral politics. And a third constraint is today's large degree of identity between men and women in education, in professions, in their wish for individuality and individualism. So I think these factors limit whatever reforms conservatives wish regarding controlling bureaucracy and controlling expertise. They limit or constrain any reforms conservatives wish regarding reducing consumer excess and regenerating the dominance of family life. So I think one needs to keep these limits in mind in order to liberate at least some of today's conservatives from excessive hopes or maybe even fantasies. The main liberation I have in mind, however, is not this, but it's liberation from two other or perhaps deeper errors or mistakes. The first mistake is to think that we can or even should do without the teaching of equal natural rights, as we see it in the Declaration of Independence. The thought that we can somehow do without that as the heart of our understanding of justice and what our common good seeks to secure. For on what other grounds could one defend the political or moral equality that conservatives wish to defend and condemn the slavery that all abhor, or even argue against the dominance of group rights and identities? I think that what one might think of as arm waving about equal dignity or Christian equality or even classical freedom is insufficient in the light of ancient slavery, the history of Catholic otherworldliness and priestly and hierarchical control, and a moral dignity of the Kantian sort that is separate from natural inclination. So such dignity or equality, can usefully support equal natural rights, but only, I think, when interpreted primarily in terms of equal rights. However, is the assertion of equal natural rights merely that, merely an assertion, or merely our tradition? And I would say no. Equal natural rights are natural, and therefore we can defend them rationally. They're not mere opinions, but, as was said, self-evident truths. We can show this if asked. They're obvious if we look without obfuscation, therefore the existence of and their tie to enlightenment. They're unavoidable. You can't deny them. You can't deny natural freedom and authority without contradiction. And substantively, I would say that natural rights are what one sees when looking at oneself. The ability to choose, the ability to reflect, the ability to prefer, the ability to be authoritative, and not immediately, but perhaps ultimately, the ability to execute and to act. And then they become a ground or premise for government because they belong to natural authority, because they belong to natural authority. So that's one point. But one question easily could be, do equal individual natural rights lead to rampant individualism and therefore to the dissolution of social institutions? That's an argument that one obviously sometimes hears. I would say that they need not, if one sees that they are connected to certain virtues of character. So to use one's rights well requires responsibility, requires industriousness, requires tolerance, requires a certain civility. And those virtues those elements of character connected to natural rights, are grounds for limiting unbridled excess. So I'm claiming here, at least, that a proper teaching about equal natural rights, their indispensability, their truth, and their link to, not distance from, their link to certain virtues at least, is the first step, or a first step, in liberating conservatism and liberating liberalism and progressivism also, liberating them from error, from mere traditionalism, and perhaps especially from the occasional or more than occasional excessive criticism of modernity. The second mistake, broadly, to be liberated from is the view that the freedom to satisfy desire, which is the general direction for the use of equal rights, the second mistake to be liberated from is the view that the freedom to satisfy desire is sufficient for happiness. It's not, as any reader of Aristotle's Ethics, or for that matter, any serious or mature adult knows. This truth, of course, is known to many conservatives, although perhaps it isn't the view of many libertarians. Now, it's also important to recognize the disjunction between equal rights and unequal excellence. Even with the liberal virtues I mentioned and others, even with those, there's a difference between using your rights effectively, and using them for the fullest ends or the fullest purposes. And that difference is the ground, or a ground, for reasonable substantive inequalities and for limits to traditional, merely traditional inequalities. This difference, however, between equal natural rights and the proper or excellent purposes to which one can turn them, that difference is also part of what limits political perfection, something conservatives as well as liberals should remember. A third mistake is to downplay while also not amplifying, the place of institutions in securing equal rights. And that's the transition to my next main topic, what can be done to improve understanding of these matters, and also what can be done to improve the actual securing of equal rights and the paths to virtue, especially these liberal virtues that I mentioned, the paths to virtue that equal rights require. And what I'll mention is, of course, much easier to say than to do. First, as I think perhaps almost all of today's conservatives will argue, are education reforms. Among them, school choice, homeschooling, charter schools, private schools, and maybe even support for training and certificate programs not tied to schools. So more public and private money, or diversion of public money and private money, will lead to improvement, but not perfection. And it would also, at the high school or even primary school level, inoculate against some of the distortions or diseases of college education. Second, are government reforms, by which I primarily mean reduced government, not expanded government, but reduced government. Politically, from a conservative viewpoint, 3 good elections in a row, nationally and locally, would help. It's achievable, but unlikely, of course, but nonetheless achievable. I think that reducing government should remain a conservative goal, because government has occupied too many of the areas in which private effort and responsibility might flourish. I have in mind reduction both in regulations and in government preferences and incentives. In doing that, in exercising those reductions, one is looking for an invigorating of private institutions and freedom, and of private interests. All of these things are obviously subject to specifics and to debate, but nonetheless, it's the goal. Many examples of this, which are discussed: fewer regulations on small business, fewer restrictions in the environmental realm, less interference there, less excessive civil rights litigation, pruning state and federal legal codes, severely pruning them, pruning the size of bureaucracy and some of the permanent status of bureaucrats. All of these measures, my judgment, by reducing government and reducing its impact, would help bring about the reasonable goals of securing equal rights. There's also some element of stronger government in securing rights, but it's largely government to prohibit, not to direct. Punishing ordinary crime, controlling borders, perhaps reducing university tax breaks, and even some of the areas and amounts of philanthropic giving. Addressing again, and perhaps controlling more, nonprofit status. At the state governmental level, directing state colleges and universities to limit some of their law and medical school excesses. Developing new units within state universities. All of these things are, in a certain sense, positive, though most are merely prohibiting, and fit within the general argument I'm making. A third area of improvement in securing the free exercise of one's rights is the control of dominance by experts, where expertise is unnecessary, controlling the dominance of experts in the areas where expertise is unnecessary, or where it's more controversial than it pretends, or where it is foolishly single-minded. That's obviously connected to reducing bureaucracy and to reining in specialization, excessive specialization. And it means, in a sense, just thinking of all the places where you did not and would not need a degree to guide your own life, or where, if you did turn to experts, you wouldn't act with it without receiving a second opinion. The central point is that goals and ends, human goals and ends and purposes, and their interplay are matters of practical judgment and matters of practical choice, not of special expertise. Now, in some ways, the most difficult problem today concerns the decay of many social and private institutions. It's difficult to achieve virtue of character without healthy institutions. Some of the difficulty with one-sided institutions, such as the media, is already alleviated and could be increasingly alleviated through vigorous competition. For some of the others, improvement in some of the other institutions, better education of those who actually run things, those who actually run the museums and the philanthropies, better education would help. But also, again, as I said, fewer government preferences would also help. There's also, of course, connected to this, a concern about the decline of religious life and institutions, and a wish for a kind of religious revival. I think that the wish for religious revival has something of a natural basis in reverence, in sanctity, in consolation. It's not merely a wish, in other words, for authoritative revelation or the dominance of one's own group. And in the US, religious life has been advanced in a way by religious competition. So, for example, the overtaking to some large degree of mainstream Protestantism by more evangelical groups, and their connection and their comfort with free enterprise and wealth. But American religion seems to me, and this may be true of religion generally, to require strong families. They don't cause each other, but there's an interplay. So the weakening of the family, especially for those with low incomes, is a great failure. I don't think myself that selfish individualism is the only cause here. Diminishing government programs, carefully monitored, would help. So would diminishing costly regulation economically. So also would help much more strength in controlling crime, drugs. But nonetheless, it's a difficult to solve. And I don't see anything, I think, in any of the other conservatisms that would meet this problem any better. Because the limits that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk have their effect, as I said, on anything that one might do. So, merely to conclude, I've mentioned what I think are the central errors or the central mistakes or the mere ignorance from which one needs to be liberated, and some plausible, I think, though difficult, ways to improve the responsible securing of equal rights and acting on them. So with that, I've concluded my talk, and thank you for listening.
Well, thank you for talking. I'm not sure you've left anything unmentioned or uncovered, but let's see from the questioners. And questions means objections, amplifications, whatever.
That's right. Bernhard.
Oh, thanks. Nice to see you again, Mark, but from I guess a distance. Just a, I guess, question related to universities, which I think is of major interest and topic for all of us. You mentioned universities only slightly in your point about educational reform. Could you say more about that, or do you just think they're hopeless, at least until there are 4 or 5 successful election cycles? Because I guess the other aspect is it seems very much related to government funding, which is driving a lot of the wackiness that's occurring throughout. I mean, you did mention that, but could you say more about universities, if there's a separate way you think or separate prospect for some reform?
Yeah, well, one thing I'd mention, in addition, obviously, to what you just said, and this overall reduction of government imperatives, right? Not just funding, but imperatives and demands. I think that would be helpful. It's difficult, obviously, to change universities because people are there forever, right? So it's an extremely hard thing to change on the ground in the classroom, though easier to change if you pulled out much of this government requirement and demand and maybe funding. Having said that, there are things that can be done and that are being done at the state level. One can try to begin new schools and new programs which become attractions for certain kinds of students, which enable hiring of people who are better and have a basic sensible view of liberal education and political education. There are not that many of them being produced, but they're there. So that's something you can certainly do at the state level, and maybe even at the private level, depending on the group of trustees that one actually has. So working around the current colleges and universities, but in conjunction with them, adding programs to them, adding opportunities to them, adding certain kinds of faculty to them. That's one thing that's being done in some places and could actually be usefully done in other places. That, together with what you've said, together with some attempts, which again are occurring, to add to education so that education is not primarily university education, summer programs of various sorts. Do all these add up to enough? That's a real question, but it's not that there's nothing that one can do, and some of these things are already being done. I think that's basically what I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is we raised some great points. One of the questions I always have with this, is how much is this a question of policy and politics, and how much of it is a question of will? And that seems to me to be the really hard part. And maybe part of the reason why some of the far right they've started to, or the new right, however you want to call them, started to cleave to government solutions to this rather than the civil society solution. Because it seems like you look around and with the decline of religion, decline of all these things, part of it's a decline of people's will. And so it's easier to use, seems easier, even if it's ultimately less effective, to use mechanisms of government to address these issues than it is to just try to convince people to get out there and do things. You only have to convince fewer people. Convince fewer people if you're convincing the government to do it than if you're trying to convince everybody to go back to church, to go back to all this. So, from that perspective, what is the political solution versus the social solution, and kind of what's the mixture therein?
I mean, in my view, there's no perfect mixture, right? But if a lot less government in a lot of areas would open up more space and territory for private efforts and private activities. Would they work? Wouldn't they work? That's something one would really have to look at. So that's really the first thing I'd say. And the second thing I'd say is that, and I did say, is that more aggressive government action in its classical areas, crime, in our case, not just crime, but crime and drugs. I think all of that would help. But then you do have to some degree rely on natural leadership in the private world. I think there's plenty of that. the results would be limited, but I think there is in fact plenty of that. I don't think there's very much by way of positive, assertive government action, which would be useful. Most of it, I think, is and would be negative. I gave one or two examples of assertive government action in the institutions that government itself controls, universities, state universities. But I would still say that the kinds of things I talked about, I think would be a help. I mean, more than that is to ask, I think, for too much, especially from the standpoint of a kind of conservative disposition.
So now we hear from not so conservative people, because it seems like everything you say seems fairly, who can disagree really, because it's very sensible, but maybe Susan Shaw will disagree.
Well, Anna has already stolen my thunder as someone who doesn't think she's conservative in a partisan sense, but has to admit that as things progress, if that's the word, finds herself increasingly what my parents used to call a fellow traveler.
Yeah, that
So
wasn't the
that's
path that
enough.
they were talking about, though. Yeah.
But in any case, one thing, unless I missed it, that you didn't speak much about, which I think some people who sympathize with some of the conservative themes, but perhaps not all of them, usually look for, is an emphasis on the Constitution and constitutionalism. And there seems to have been a kind of, perhaps because of disputes about how to read a constitution, in some quarters at least, a falling away, shall I say, from an emphasis on the Constitution, which used to be one way of moderating, and in all the ways that Harvey Mansfield, I think, has so brilliantly conveyed in some of his own writings, and you yourself as well, and others in this platform, room. So could you say something about the Constitution and how you think what would be an intelligent conservative approach to reminding people, if that's appropriate, of the importance of a strong Constitution and a kind of veneration for the Constitution?
You know, I think the Constitution, and this may be something that people will dispute, needs to be connected to the Declaration of Independence. It needs to be connected to the purpose that it serves. It needs to be connected to an understanding of the equal natural rights that it serves. I think that's important. I think one can't simply look at it on its own, but has to look at it in terms of its purpose and its meaning. Having done that, a second thing to pay attention to, which is connected to, but you might say not exactly the Constitution, is federalism and the importance of the states and the separateness of states, which at one point was an old conservative theme, but it was connected to the South, or became connected to the South and states' rights. But now many things go on at a state level, separate from the federal level, which are useful and important. So I mentioned, first of all, those two things before turning to the more basic constitutionalism. And there, for sure, what one would like is to have a proper understanding of each of the elements of government, of what their function is, what their proper function is, and what their limits should be. But, there are issues and problems because of this enormous growth, not just of government generally, but of the presidency. And one needs to seriously try to carve out the proper areas for each of the elements of government as I think originally understood. But in a way, slightly different from most, I think an emphasis on the purpose, an emphasis on limits in relation to states, an emphasis especially on the proper structure of the government itself would be very important. As for matters such as the Bill of Rights, the that's something that's connected, obviously, to one's understanding of the Declaration. So constitutionalism is important, but I don't think it's the only thing that's important now. My view.
David Epstein.
I thank you, Mark. I wondered if what you've described is sort of private advice for how conservatives should think, rather than advice to a politician, say, about how to articulate things. I mean, how much of this would you urge a politician to use in his explaining what ought to be done? In particular, I wonder whether the issues of climate and race are not pretty dominant in obstructing people's appreciation for equal natural rights, that somehow equal natural rights is not really sufficient in light of those two issues.
Well, I'm not in the business of advising politicians, and it depends, obviously, on which one of them one is addressing. But yeah, no, I think equal natural rights and the basic grounding in the individual and in individual excellence and in family is a very important way to talk about, both against, but where necessary, in relation to race, ethnicity, and identity. So I think that is, in fact, a central way in which one would need to talk about those issues. And in many ways, that's traditional as well. So I don't see that would be an enormous difficulty. It may be difficult, of course, to break through, but the ground of the rhetoric, I think, would be that ground and would be a reasonable ground. In terms such as of climate, I mean, that's a more concrete issue. If one thinks that it's all overstated, one has to say that, unless you think that it's just an issue that you'd rather not talk about unless someone makes you talk about it. But if someone makes you talk about it, of course, you acknowledge that there's some human relation to climate change. You don't deny it in those kinds of ways, but you talk about it moderately, and you talk about it in relation to the economy. I think all of that would be reasonably successful with an audience that this kind of politician might be willing to address. So I don't see that as a major difficulty, and especially in terms of the relation, the connection of race, identity, all those issues, to equal rights and the individual ground of equal rights as in many ways a counter to that kind of argument.
Well, what about woke? Related, you haven't used that word, but it's quite current, and yeah, I guess it refers both to climate and race. Is there a conservative way to speak of identity?
Yeah, I think woke does refer more to race, maybe than to climate. Climate is a somewhat separate issue. Yeah, sure, there's a conservative way to talk about it. I still think the basic conservative way to talk about it is individual excellence, and individual effort, and individual character, the way conservatives like, at least, to interpret Martin Luther King's speeches. I think that is a fundamental way to talk about it. Of course, you can talk about race as part of what you are, ethnicity, tradition, history, but how important that should be for you is a matter in many ways of individual choice. So I think you can't talk about it terribly much. You can't allow race to be the way people think of themselves and define themselves and understand themselves, if you think that that's wrong. So you can talk about it a bit, but I think you primarily have to talk about matters such as character, rights, and excellence. Otherwise, you are having the discussion on someone else's ground, which I don't think is usually successful, certainly not politically successful.
But isn't that somewhat putting the cart before the horse? Because how can you build character unless you have good structures, good institutions, good families, good whatever? So this is why we are where we are, because people realize the game is tremendously rigged for a lot of, at least, children.
Yeah. Well, all that's true, but nonetheless, I think you have to remind people what the purpose and the goal is, which is character and rights and ultimately some sense of excellence. That has to be done, at least together with making clear why some of the game is rigged or some of the institutions are harmful. Otherwise, you're raising issues, but not in terms of any goals and ends. And I don't think that's really a successful thing to do. I mean, you know, some political people can magically convince people to vote for them, whatever they say. But those people wouldn't be asking me for advice, I think. And many of the people who are successful politically do talk about serious issues in a certain way, at least. So I don't think you can avoid what I just said. And it's not something that the things I'm saying, as has been said, they're not remote from ordinary views. They're not remote from ordinary understanding. They're not remote from what any sensible adult understands are useful characteristics. So I think I would still lean more heavily in that direction.
Thank you. Shep.
Thank you, Mark. This really builds on something that Anna just said. You talked a bit about the family, the two-parent family, and in recent weeks, there's been more attention to this, largely because of a book by Melissa Kearney, a liberal economist, basically showing the enormous research indicating that the terrible effects of single-parent families on poor children. So I guess I have two questions. First, given the extent that those on the left have been very reluctant to talk about this, what can be done to get more attention? But probably more importantly, it's not clear what to do. I mean, libertarians basically say that's none of our business. And the kind of moralists on the right have made the issue something that people on the left don't want to talk about. So, and also there's no indication that things we've done in the past, whether it be incentives or moral suasion, have done much to address the problem. So I wonder if you could say something about that issue.
Well, as I said, that's of course, you know, an extremely difficult problem because anyone can see that, and it's difficult to know what to do about it. And what some more aggressive conservatives want to do by way of incentives and so on haven't actually seemed to work in the past, and there's no maybe particular reason to think they would. Well, there are two things that might be helpful. One is a reduction, but this one has to look at very carefully, in government programs. In other words, to make it more difficult, and this would be very controversial, but more difficult in fact, to bring up children simply as a single parent in most cases. I think because if you think about it, what brought about many marriages that maybe were not marriages simply chosen was the necessity, actually, economically, of a family in the absence of sufficient amounts that would come from private charity and so on. So I think one would have to look pretty carefully at that. You'd have to look very carefully at much more stringency in education, making sure that people are educated so that you delay their entrance into family life, so that they are, when they're young, all of us, where we should best be when we're young in an economy in a country such as ours. People need to be kept in school more and learn more. And then there are all these arguments, which I think are reasonable, but I don't know how far they go, about teenage pregnancy and lack of understanding and ways one could limit teenage pregnancy, addressing mostly the women, or in many cases, the girls almost, in those situations. So I point to those three things that I've mentioned, but I wouldn't want to predict enormous success. But I think what I'm saying is not completely, pie in the sky.
Shep, do you want to follow up on this?
Nothing. I just said that one of the things that's strange about recent developments is that teenage pregnancies have gone way down.
Right.
So we have started to address that. So there is some hope in that regard. And the two-parent families among people with a BA has remained pretty steady.
Right.
So the problem tends to be the people who, as you said, don't have any education past high school. And that's one reason why this should appeal. Doing something about this should appeal to people on the left, because it's the children of poor families that are really suffering most.
Yeah, it should appeal to people on the left, but in current politics, it doesn't, or they won't talk about it, as you said. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's really kind of, maybe we're at the point where the response to Moynihan, which is 50 years old or more, and maybe we can hope that will wane.
Yeah, yeah.
Would you want to connect this to a point you made at the beginning of your talk about one of the limits being the equality of men and women?
Yeah.
Doesn't that make reform of or a recovery of the two-parent family more difficult?
Yes, and I said that, and I indicated that, and it's especially, of course, it especially makes difficult what some conservatives want, which is not just the two-parent family, but lots of kids, and that's, I think, very unlikely. But as Shep said, among those with a BA, you do have, as he said, more or less a steadiness in marriage. Thus, the children are had later, and not as many of them. But I think that the independence of women, the interest in careers, is a limit. It's not the same limit as the limit that I mentioned that connects expertise in technology and national security, but I think it's a serious limit. Nonetheless, since there's obviously a natural basis for the two-parent family, there's a natural basis for wanting children and rearing them, I think that with some reduction in government, with better education, and keeping people in school longer in a productive way, this issue could be dealt with. But nonetheless, the independence of women has an effect on this, and it's not something I think that is going to change in any way that one will see immediately, midterm, even long term. So it's a constraint, but not, I don't think, necessarily an unbridgeable constraint in terms of the firmer existence of families, especially among those with less wealth, lower middle class, even, in fact, on down. I also mentioned, I think this is important too, greater control of crime, drugs, and so on. I mean, one has to make one has to look hard at the difficult overall living situation, right? Not just the family situation in many of the areas that one is most concerned about. And that's something government could do. They can control drugs much better. They can control crime much better and make life in general more bearable in many areas as well.
Tom Palmer, I believe. Are you there?
You mentioned the pernicious effect of academia and the likelihood that that's not going to change, or the impossibility of it. And I was in the media for 40 years and never really happy that we were educating people even-handedly. But of course, I've never been more discouraged than I am today. And I just wondered what your thoughts were on how much of an effect the media compared to academia has on our inability to get back to these things that work, reasonable values, and whether that's equally impossible to change as academia seems to be.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, of course, for sure. It has a harmful effect. You can certainly say that, but on the other hand, you know, there's a lot more competition in the media. There are many places you can go. You might say that, you know, an effect of that competition is that you go only to the places you want to go, and you don't hear very much more broadly. But, you know, given the fact of the possibility of competition, I don't think that the media is, speaking in the most general broad sense, is a lost cause, because it's not singular. You know, there's so many outlets, and I think that's largely what I would say. You know, there are all these questions about what one should or shouldn't do with the social media, and what government should or shouldn't do. I guess my more immediate view of that is it's better on the whole now for things to be open, with a lot of competition, with very little control. But I could change my mind about that, you know, at any given time. But in terms of any positive forming of the media, so that the media more positively forms or introduces sensible principles and sensible character, I don't think I see that exactly. You need to reinvigorate, maybe in one more last point, not just in kind of print and talk media, but perhaps also in popular media, movies, and so on, documentaries. Be nice if one could have some more alternatives there too. But that's as far as I think, go.
I'd certainly agree there's more choice today, and that's better than at some points in the past, although the liberals seem to be much more convincing in every area than even if many people watch Fox News, than the conservatives. Just on that question of woke, I would say you mentioned two topics, but the question of sex, which is today known as gender, is also huge in terms of what's woke today, not just climate change and race. Thanks very much.
Sure, thanks.
Alex Orwin.
Can you hear?
I can.
So I think this is a good, many good suggestions about an elevated way to discuss these matters in class for us professors when they come up. But yeah, in terms of the broader political sphere, does this have any interest for conservative voters these days? That's certainly not my impression. They're interested in fighting and culture wars and arguing, but not really thinking about policy or these kinds of questions. You know, if that's true, or since we're a democracy, what hope is there of this having any practical influence outside maybe what we should say in class or say amongst ourselves?
Yeah, I think that no, a lot of this does have an impact, not just with conservative voters, but with traditionally liberal voters. There's nothing peculiar about it, or nothing overly remote about it. Many conservative politicians, even during the presidential debate in the few seconds they had to try to say something about something, mentioned all of these issues. They're usually mentioned in general terms, but I think they have serious resonance. I don't think it's merely a matter of conflict, but conflict is there. I mean, you need to fight, not simply be polite, though within restraints. But I guess I would say that lots of this does have a lot of resonance with conservative voters, especially obviously in the states and the districts where conservatives remain dominant. But even I think at the national level, all things being equal. So I don't think this is merely a kind of academic discussion, though we're a certain kind of audience, but there are many ways to talk about these matters, and not all that differently from the way in which I talk about them, in which that one could use, and that many conservative politicians do use, from Reagan on at least, and no doubt before that. So I guess I don't quite agree that this is simply or primarily academic or classroom talk. But again, that's obviously disputable.
Isn't that one of the weaknesses of your position, that you're honest and you have to say, I don't know if many of these things will make much of a difference in the face of all the obstacles it faces? You'd make a terrible primary candidate.
Right. I wouldn't talk this way, though I would still be. I wouldn't say those things, though I'd still be a terrible primary candidate for a variety of other reasons. Yeah, sure, of course. You don't want to show hesitancy too much. That's sure, of course. Yeah.
Alexei, our wonderful new postdoc.
Hi. Thank you, Professor Blitz. That was very interesting. You mentioned the importance of character as determining the extent to which a doctrine of rights could serve as an instrument to the pursuit of excellence. But to an extent, I've not mentioned the fact that another presupposition, or that link, also exists at the collective level. And it seems to me that one of the most important factors influencing our national or collective character today is polarization. It determines the way in which we talk and behave towards each other. And polarization has made us talk and behave towards each other as if we didn't want to have anything to do with one another, from left to right. And it has also determined the type of men that are successful in rising to the top. And it seems to me that a conservative position that works under the premise that the only kind of government is a very limited government sort of presuppose the desire within society to stick as one people. And I would like to ask you whether you think that's the case in the US, and therefore whether you think that there is not a genuine role for public power in restoring that national unity.
Yeah, so I am in favor of limited government, but strong in certain areas. And some of the areas that I mentioned at the beginning, in terms of national security and so on, will mean that there will always be a strong government. It's clear enough if you look at the general view now of our control of our borders that there is still a kind of national unity. I mean, it's control of the borders is something which is popular, generally speaking, though not clearly among enough Democratic politicians. So my polarized statement will be that the problem of polarization is largely something caused by the extreme leftward shift of the Democrats, and that more sensible Democrats, grounded on the principles and the kinds of arguments I'm making, though obviously with adjustments, that would be the movement that I would like to see and would be reasonable, I think, among many of their voters. So I don't think that national unity is necessarily a problem. One has to be certain about it, but one has to be certain to pay attention to it. But those, I think, are the two things I would say, that the polarization is not a two-sided thing. It's mostly a problem of where the Democrats have moved. And there is still lots of national unity, which you see in all sorts of events, but which you see even today as people take a look at and are concerned about securing borders. That has a lot to do with national unity. So again, that may be overly confident, but that's what I think I would say.
So it's out of the hands of conservatives because you're putting the ball now in the park of the Democrats.
Well, again, if one wins some elections, the Democrats will move, or one hopes they will move. I mean, after Ronald Reagan and then the one term for George Bush, Bill Clinton did move. Bill Clinton may always have been in that place. He was always a kind of new Democrat, as they called them then, to the degree to which there was any honesty in him at all about those matters. So, you know, losing elections leads many political figures to become more sensible. Would it necessarily in this case? I don't know, but that would help, I think, make the Democrats more sensible. Losing.
Joey Torres, are you there?
Hi,
Yes.
Joey.
Hi, Dr. Blitz. Really quickly, so you mentioned that the first mistake is sort of the thinking that we can move forward without talking about natural rights. Can you hear me? I'm sorry.
I can.
Okay. And that, of course, as you've said, is like self-direction, the ability to reflect, to prefer, to choose, to use, act, to proceed, right? And then the second mistake being that viewing freedom to satisfy one's desires is sufficient as being the next mistake. And I think back to the modern virtues that you've been writing about for so long, you know, toleration, industriousness, niceness, responsibility, and sort of linking back to the previous questions that we've heard about the woke and questions of race, and now sort of here gender. And I'm thinking about toleration and niceness with respect to something like gender on a practical level, because my private choice to use these pronouns, they, them, also has sort of a public effect that you have to, are you going to accept this? And so I guess my question is, and I fully understand that, you know, that is linked to education reform and those things, but how does toleration, niceness, sort of direct us in those very practical ways? How do they, you know, sort of tamp down or alleviate, say, the culture wars that we've been talking about? What are the limits? So, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so in this book I wrote, Responsibility in American Public Life, the virtue which I here briefly referred to as civility, I called niceness to indicate that it is a kind of a decline in the original virtue. And that's certainly true of toleration too. You know, I think toleration was first something you could understand as the grudging acceptance of those with other religious beliefs. And of course, it's now as part of this general misunderstanding of what rights, freedom, liberty mean, it's become washed out so that you're supposed to accept anybody's view of anything. So, you know, toleration, civility are hardly enough, given the way they're currently understood. Given the way they're previously understood would be another matter. I mean, I think what one needs to do in those areas is recognize again, and this is another difficulty, the conflict between majority rule and individual rights, right? You can't let everybody do exactly what they want in every public situation. Otherwise, there'd be no criminal behavior. And that's so here. You know, in the private sphere, people can call themselves what they want, but they don't have a right to demand that of the majority or of those who govern particular institutions. So those who govern particular institutions or majorities should simply demand that, right? This is the public presentation. This is the public way one behaves. Privately or among one's friends, we all call each other all sorts of things, but that's a different matter. So I would take it as part of the public's right or the majority's right to enforce its view of a certain kind of decorum, even if it makes some individuals unhappy, just as we've done it forever in all sorts of other areas. Even the Senate has now decided that it wants a dress code.
So that becomes sort of a problem for us here in California, right? Because sort of if we take a majority as, you know, a school board here or something like that, then we have to sort of accept that in this public way, right?
Well, that's if school boards are going to control how people address each other in schools, one needs better school boards. One needs to elect better school boards. And if one doesn't, one doesn't. Now, it may be that school board elections are somewhat distorted by outside money, then more conservative money needs to address itself to these kinds of local elections. But, you know, self-government means that you'll lose sometimes. You know.
Avi.
Well, a couple of small points and a broader one. You talked about the chastening effect of losing an election. It didn't seem to have much effect on Donald Trump, if you look at the last election. And the second thing, you said earlier that one of the things that government can do better is control drugs. I'd be interested to know what you have in mind that the government should be, as that seems to be an area where left and right agree, with the exception perhaps of libertarians who would say whatever you want to put in your body is your business. But more broadly, as you've been speaking, I've been thinking of how would this message reach, say, the Trump supporters, who seem to be more numerous than I would like in the Republican Party. If you really do have this polarization between the two, then the message that you are delivering on the principles of human rights and the loftier expansion of the philosophical underpinning of this country, it seems to me it would be lost on them. How do you reach the people who are really going to control the process for the next election and the one after that?
Yeah, well, so, you know, I think losing elections does have a chastening effect on almost all losers. There are exceptions. He may be one, but of course he thinks he didn't lose. So it's a kind of peculiar situation. But then to talk about his supporters, I mean, you know, we will see, of course, but I think many of his supporters, most of his supporters, the great majority of his supporters wouldn't disagree with what I've said. There are other candidates that they would support who would speak more directly to these issues, but they're now supporting Trump because he speaks more directly to them, because they feel he's been treated unjustly for a variety of reasons. But if Trump were to leave tomorrow, which is not to be expected, of course. I think that what I'm saying could easily resonate with Trump's voters, has resonated with a lot of people who are Trump's voters, but when they vote in their own states and when they vote in their own local elections, look at all the people who they actually support. So that may be, again, overly confident, but that's what I would say. In terms of drugs, I mean, there are people obviously who know much more about it than I do. Maybe the one who I know who knows the most is John Walters, right, who's now the head of the Hudson Institute. But one thing that you can do is radically restrict the drugs that are made here, and especially those that come across the border. Those are the things mostly that Republican candidates are talking about, right? When they're talking about this issue today, they're talking about drugs in Mexico, the drug lords in Mexico, and dealing with them and meeting them. So I think there's plenty that you could do in terms of supply without yet looking at this issue of demand. In terms of the issue of demand, I think that has something to do. I don't know, of course, how much it has to do with the conditions of life among especially people who use drugs but can't get out of it. Again, all of these conditions we mentioned of crime, of not much economic opportunity, of not strong families, to say the least. I don't think the issue is primarily, the use of drugs among the upper middle class and so on. Having said that, however, one of the first points I made was that there is this desire for greater a number of goods, at affordable prices. And one place you do see that is in the weakening of, let's say, marijuana laws by the people, right, in all sorts of places. So I think it's an issue, but I think one can control some demand, and you could certainly control some large amount of supply. That's what I would say, and also about the Trump voters.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead.
A question here, Mark, about your fellow conservatives. Yeah, if they are fellows. You've been emphasizing natural rights as the basis of conservatism. What about those who disagree with that or who don't take that as seriously?
Well, I think they've forgotten the only real ground of equality, and the only real ground on which you can dispute the existence of slavery. So I think they are mistaken in thinking that one could do without a serious ground for equality. It's, as I said, obviously not the only thing, even together with character, not the only thing, because there are the questions of what you do with your rights and unequal excellence. But there is no other serious ground for equality. There is no other serious ground for equal treatment. There is no other serious ground, I think, on which you could really argue against slavery. So I think they're wrong intellectually, but I think they're also wrong politically. And that's what I would say to them, and they are happy to show me that I'm wrong.
Well, more specifically, the common good conservatives.
Well, to me, what is the U.S. common good? The U.S. common good is the securing of equal rights and the securing of the character which allows that, and the helping to secure the institutions which support that, together with some understanding of excellence beyond simply, as I said, what any ordinary adult would know. That's the common good, as I see it. So, of course, government is about justice, and justice is about the common good. And part of that is equality, and part of that is sensible equalities. But to sort of let this notion of the common good go over to 1/2 or 1/3 or 1/10 of conservatives and forget that this country is about securing a common good, is a mistake. So I would simply dispute the substance of what they think might be the common good. I wouldn't dispute the fact that government means to serve a common good.
So I have a question from my dear friend Rita, who's in a coffee shop, probably smoking weed, so she can't answer it and ask it in person. Much of what you describe as ideal conservative policy and conservative priorities sounds very familiar, very similar to what would have been ideal policy and priorities 15 and even 30 or 40 years ago. Maybe that makes sense in light of what conservatism is as a philosophy of order and respect for tradition. But society does change, even if it doesn't progress. And I'm wondering what you see as most in need of revision or update in conservative priorities now, in 2023, relative to what you might have said 10 or 30, or might I add 60 years ago.
Yeah, well, or at least let's go to Reagan, so we don't have to go all the way back to Eisenhower and to Nixon. Yeah, I think the things I'm saying were fundamental then, and they're fundamental now. You would have to do different things economically because of the growth of regulation. You would have to pay more attention to the issues we've discussed in terms of family, because you have these huge differences in the numbers of two-parent families. You would have to recognize, I think, but then pay more explicit attention to controlling the importance of expertise and science. As I've said, national security is a place where you either are in line with or at the cutting edge of technological developments, or there are major problems and difficulties. So those specifics would change in terms of emphasis. You might pay more attention to climate issues, but the general things I'm saying, points I'm making, I don't think would change, and I don't think would need to change. But all of those specific matters, of course, would change. But they'll change again 20 or 30 years from now. So it's not there that I think one would make one's general arguments.
But they might change 20 or 30 years from now because things will get much, much worse. You could say the situation of men, the decline of men will get much worse relative to women because we have a very different economy. I don't know, the ability to have children on your own, to do all sorts of, we don't know where that's going.
Yeah, well, that's right. We don't know where that's going. We don't know where
World war with China. I mean, this is just stupid speculation, but it seems like if you say we have to update it in 30 years, most people, I think, would think things are going to get just basically worse and worse because...
Well, worse from what point of view? And the point of view has to be human freedom, human excellence, human rights, the fundamental goals, purposes, and ends that human beings have. That's the standard, and that standard doesn't change. And if that standard in the basic sense doesn't change, that becomes the ground for anything that you would do to improve concrete matters. That's what I would say.
Do we have more questions? Maybe you have one?
Yes. And you use a nice phrase, sensible equality, somewhat covering over the fact that that might mean very significant inequalities. Somebody could have posed the question there. So let me just say it now. What do you think? How do you defend significant inequalities?
Well, it's not possible to have real human freedom, exercise your own powers, bring about your own ends, without having some leisure, without having freedom of action. So the first thing to say is, as everyone knows, there are differences between freedom of action and equality simply. And equality of rights, extremely important, but nonetheless, free action is going to lead to certain equalities, especially in terms of not these basic liberal virtues so much, but especially in terms of ends, goals, and purposes. That's certainly one thing I would say. A second thing I would say is that it's largely been the case that certain kind of economic equality, unequal wealth, is one of the drivers of a certain degree of growth economically and in terms of general satisfaction of desire. Could be greater, this degree of economic inequality, than we would want, but it's certainly been a driver of it. So I would say those two things. Liberty to actually exercise true talents for true ends requires certain leisure and will lead to certain inequalities. The same case economically. And perhaps a third thing to say is that I think many people realize that a degree of political attention, practical judgment, practical intelligence is a good thing if you are controlling government or controlling significant institutions, and that there's education, leisure, and therefore a kind of inequality connected to that. I think one could make those kinds of arguments. The other argument that's usually made, and it's a difficult argument, more difficult argument to make now, of course, is the possibility of upward mobility, right? And you know, that is a more difficult argument to make now, perhaps, than used to be the case, though it's not a simply impossible argument. So I would say those things, or those would be the group of things that I would say. And then if you, again, forced me to act as if I was running in a primary, I would, of course, as everyone does, emphasize different elements of those arguments at different times.
Avi has another follow-up question, and people who this talk is so sensible, so it seems like everybody can kind of agree on it, which is its great strength, but maybe also its great weakness, because it's like, yeah, well, what can we say? The problem is how we're going to bring any of this really about. So if there's more people like Shep who raise some objections, that would be nice. But Avi, you can go first.
Well, in the category, yes, of bringing this about, how would you say that social media, which of course has become a major force, albeit disparate in society, how does that factor into the objectives you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, again, I guess we all have our views about social media. I lean more in the direction, and have always leaned more in the direction, but this could be wrong, of treating social media something like public utilities, and therefore not attempting to control very much what's there. It's a difficulty, especially because of the lack of enough control by parents, but that's the direction in which I would go. If I had to do something politically, I'd try to look at measures dealing with young people. I'm not sure what one could really do that would be successful, but I would rather err in the direction of openness than in the direction of government control, because governments control things sometimes for a common good, but often for their own good. So that's what I would say, and would leave it at that, short of really coming to know the issue in a concrete manner, a more concrete manner than I do.
That sounds similar to what Elon Musk seems to be saying with X, which used to be Twitter, that everything goes or anything goes. And the problem, of course, is that people can write really hateful and really insightful comments, which can cause significant damage. You know, in the old days when you had some nuts who had some nutty theory about something, you know, one in Dubuque and one in Nashville and one in San Diego, hard for them to get together. Now, with a keystroke, they're all together. And obviously the potential here for enormous damage to individuals without, if you're suggesting that we're not going to have any kind of restriction on it, I'm not sure where I am on this. I value the free speech and general openness, but I can see some significant problems that can come from the really anything goes approach to, say, X. And then there are consequences that have to be dealt with, usually with more draconian measures than we would like.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's certainly true that conspiracy has now spread from 5 people talking to each other in Cambridge. So strange views can now more easily be spread across the country. But the issue is, what does one do or can one do by way of control? I mean, again, one would have to know more about the actual operation of these things than I certainly do. Presumably, you can control a little bit the spread of views through likes and interconnections and so on. And it's certainly always been the case that government has controlled pornography as addressed to the young. So I think I would look at maybe the more traditional controls that one has used together still, I think, with largely a more open and public utility approach. And it will be imperfect. And I could change my mind about that, but that's how I would see it. You know, maybe not unlike the way you see it on the whole.
We'll have an intelligence expert called Calder Walton on our fall schedule this year, and he definitely says social media places like Twitter need to be regulated because the disinformation is going to be absolutely massive and uncontrollable by foreign governments. But that's just an aside. Susan has another question.
I'm once again goaded by Anna into registering a mild protest.
Awesome. I like it. Kindred spirits.
So in the interest of finding common ground, I just want to either give you the chance to maybe walk back a little bit, something you said, or only register my own disagreement. And that has to do with where on polarization, you really put all the burden, the moral burden on the Democrats. And at least from where I sit, boy, I mean, the Republicans are at least as far out there in terms of the budget, you know, the shutdown and absolute refusal to criticize Trump in any meaningful way. And so I don't think that's really, you know, there aren't any voices raised against Biden or wokeism among the Democrats. So isn't it true that there's at least plenty of blame to go around? Is it really the Democrats who have pushed us into this terrible direction, and really the Republicans are all reasonable, moderate people? I mean, that doesn't the way I think that isn't really the way it looks to many voters.
Yeah. Yes, I would put the blame on the Democrats. I'm not walking that back. It doesn't mean 100%. And even the 2 examples you gave, I mean, government shutdown the threat of government shutdown happens every 6 months or every year or every 2 years, and it gets resolved, and it will get resolved one way or another. And they're not major issues. It certainly would have been resolved more quickly if more Republicans had actually won in the House. I mean, McCarthy has this tiny majority to deal with. If he had 10 more Republicans, it would be over. Again, in terms of Trump, I think one can't simply identify Republican voters with Trump voters. They support Trump, but they support a lot of things that Trump stands for that other people will stand for too. And if he disappeared tomorrow,
but he's done outrageous things that never get called out except by people who aren't Republicans.
Yeah.
With very few
But
exceptions.
yeah, excessive government, crazy wokeness, the real excessive control of energy and energy independence, a crazily open border, right? All those things are Democrat things. And there's no reason for Republicans to take equal blame for any of those major issues. Sure, more Republicans should say that Trump lost the election and he ought to face up to that fact. That's the thing that you want them to say. They're not, most of them, going to be against his policies, because his policies are one version of fairly standard, Republican, right?
It's his lawless behavior.
Yeah, but this one issue, well, but that again, if you look from a Republican standpoint, there's all sorts of unconstitutional behavior, or flirting with unconstitutional behavior, or flirting with untraditional and dangerous behavior that Democrats have been involved with. So I'm not for the broader issues walking these things back. It would be good, obviously, I think, not everyone would agree with this, if some candidate were the Republican candidate for president other than Trump. But on all of those issues that I mentioned, which are broad and fundamental issues, I consider the Democratic movement way to the left to be more dangerous. We'll see.
A lot of people disagree with you, and there's not going to be common ground unless we can kind of move a little bit closer on that.
Yeah, I don't believe in common ground based on nothing. It's really common ground.
I thought we were friends.
It has to be. It has to be.
I hope we still are.
Yeah, personal friendship is still another matter. Yeah. So that's
this is wonderful. The little flash at the end. I was going to remark on recent behavior of universities in changing their alma mater. For example, Harvard changed it to remove two words, Puritan stock, which I think is highly objectionable. And then Amherst College has moved away from its wonderful song, which praises Lord Jeffrey Amherst, who conquered all the enemies that came within his view and looked around for more when he was through. And I was going to use that to characterize your talk today. But we'll leave it as a draw right here at the end.
Good.
Thanks so much, Mark. You were great.
Thank you.